Hi, everybody. Welcome to your Money Map, sponsored by the Alliance for Lifetime Income. I'm your host, Jean Chatzky. And today we are diving into the topic of retirement, choosing the right time to retire. It can be complicated, it can be confusing, and that's even in the best financial circumstances. But when you are dealing with the time that we've been in for the past couple of years, it can be downright daunting. And that's why people are worried about the markets. People are worried about inflation. People are worried about longevity. In fact, statistics show, research shows 77% of people believe that the stock market will be volatile, will continue this spate of volatility that we've been on through the rest of the year. 67% of people are more concerned than they have been with paying bills right now and saving for the future. That's according to some recent research from Allianz Life. Inflation concerns have forced about half of all people to reduce or stop their retirement contributions, and just less than half have actually dipped into their retirement funds because of inflation. You know, it calls for a reset. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. We're going to do it with Jill Schlesinger. You all know her, of course. She is the CBS News Business Analyst and the author of a great new book called The Great Money Reset. Jill, welcome. Glad to have you along, and congratulations on the book.
Oh, thank you. It was absolutely a labor of love. So I love talking about this one. I know you're not supposed to favor your children. You're a parent, but you've written a lot of books. Some you like better than others. This one, I really do love this one.
You know, it's interesting to hear you say that, because as somebody who has written books, I know that whether or not they are a labor of love, they can be kind of a hellish experience. So, what was it? What was it that said to you, "I really need to write this book right now"?
I have a friend of mine who's also my book agent, which is always a funny thing to say out of my mouth because I can't believe I'm that person. But people like Jean Chatzky have book agents, not people like me.
No.
And he was like, "Don't you have another book in you?" And I'm like, "Oh no, I'm tired. It's the pandemic. I can't possibly." And so he said, "Well, give it some thought." And I had put together a couple of proposals that I didn't actually like that much. I was noodling around. And one day, Brian said to me, my agent, he said, Brian DiFiore, he said, "What is getting you jazzed right now?" And this is probably sort of the fall of 2020. I said, "Something amazing has been happening on my podcast." And I said, we went to a daily podcast amid the pandemic because so much was going on and there were so many people freaking out and all these new resources and stimulus programs and small business resources. So we just went to every day because we had so much happening and people were writing in. And I said, something remarkable is happening. People are actually really rethinking their lives in a way that I've never seen, either as a financial planner when I did that for 14 years or for the last dozen years that I've been doing what I'm doing. I've never heard so many people really starting to say, is this really how I want to live? And making proactive changes. And a lot of it had to do with retirement. Some of it was around people who were forced to retire, it wasn't their choice. Some people who were fried, just completely burnt out. A lot of healthcare people who really got in touch with us and said, "I cannot do this anymore." And really the flow of questioning really was about a very personal story. Like, I now have the time and the energy to look within myself, reconsider what my family obligations are, and maybe I want to do things differently. And I guess once in a century pandemics have a way of making you think deeper about who you are.
When you looked at these people who were thinking deeper, did they Was it one thing that spurred them into action in general? Was it a variety of things? I'm very struck by the burnout that
Mhm.
just was sort of creeping up on them and then getting ready to explode. Did they fall into a bunch of different categories?
I think the latter, a bunch of different categories. I think that there were a lot of people, there were burnout people for sure. But there were a lot of professionals who maybe after schlepping into work every day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week, now we're at home. A lot of knowledge workers had the benefit of working from home, were in their homes, were with their spouses or their partners, saw their kids, realized that death and illness was all around them, that life is mercurial. And it did have a way of sort of igniting a thought process that many of us may have had from time to time. Maybe it has happened when there's a birth or a death or a divorce, but rarely does it happen collectively where
Yeah.
we are all pushed in this situation together. And I think that was a really big difference. I think for some younger people also may have been looking at the trajectory that they were on and said, well, is this really what I want to do? I mean, maybe I went to law school, maybe I went to medical school, maybe I was on a track of being a business consultant, maybe being home and really living a life and having a little bit more of a taste of what life could be,
Mm.
made me think differently. And there were also a lot of people who had side hustles during the pandemic who were really intrigued by the idea of making that side hustle the main hustle. And this isn't in the book, but I just had a call with someone on my podcast, and she was sort of a recidivist caller, and she just said, I spoke to you in 2019. It was the end of 2019. It was before COVID hit. And I was telling you how I was working and I was a little bit like in the drudgery of work. And she said, and I want you to know that during COVID, I listened to your podcast every day and I decided to make my side hustle my main hustle. And now I'm calling you, 3 years later to tell you that, I am here. I have survived. I'm making more money than I made in my main job with my side hustle, and I need some help about how to create a retirement plan for myself. So that's kind of like the great upside benefit, is that you get to hear from people in after the fact.
That's a fantastic call. I hope that made your day.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
if I had to boil the book down to a sentence, I would say it's about navigating major life changes. And the nice thing about it is that it's really advice that extends so far beyond the pandemic, because people we know go through these major life shifts, not just in the years when we're facing a national crisis, but all the time, right? I mean, if I looked at the major crises or the major life changes that you explore in the book, whether we're talking about changing careers slightly, whether we're talking about moving, whether we're talking about getting married or getting divorced or thinking about retirement, I could sort of check them all off. And so I like that there is a game plan essentially for all of these life shifts. But I know that you say that the place that you have to start, no matter what you're going through, is with a planning process. What does that entail?
I'm trained as a certified financial planner, and so I like having guardrails up. I really do, and it is very much my personality that I am a little bit of a math nerd, and I'm also a little bit of a crazy person when it comes to process. And so I wanted to be able to have some process around helping people make shifts responsibly, right? Like I can be a dreamer, and dreaming is great, but to put that dream into action, I actually have to have a way to do it. So, I think that every single one of my conversations with people, whether it was pre pandemic or post pandemic, uh, starts with this idea of where are you right now? And this gets into like the nitty gritty, nerdy financial planning stuff, but it's a lot more fun when you give it a new name. So I gave it a new name, and that's what it does. Working in network news for a dozen years, you have to have fun names. So I called it the Fabulous Five. Um, and the reason I want people to really pay attention to this is that it doesn't matter whether you're 25 or 65. This is a process for every single person to go through when you're either contemplating a change or even just thinking about a future goal. So it starts with calculating, what are my resources? What does that mean? It means, what do I own? What are my assets? And you can just list it on a piece of paper. And before anyone eyes have those eyes roll back in your head and say, I'm not good at math, we're making a list. Okay. So there's no math involved right now. Okay. So list out your assets and what you own. And when you do this, I want you to kind of have two thoughts at the same time. Like, an asset is just something you own, but they're assets of different types. So pay attention to what's liquid or accessible to you and what might have a tax ramification, like a retirement account, a pre-tax retirement account, and something that's illiquid, like a house. And that's just to note that when you're making big life changes, if you have illiquid assets or you have an asset that's not been taxed yet, it has a different kind of a use case in making a transition. So you check out your assets. And I also like people to kind of pay attention to, what is the income that you're earning and what are the benefits you receive. A lot of resets have to do with losing the sort of mothership of an employer.
Mm.
And in that case, we want to understand, well, not just what is my salary, but what am I getting in terms of health insurance? What am I getting in life insurance? Is there a retirement plan match? Is there a health savings account that I've been able to use? And when you start tallying up some of those things, it doesn't mean that you should be tethered to that job forever, but it does mean that there is a lot of value there that you might not be placing value on right now until you lose it. And so I
Yeah.
think that's a big issue. S-
I mean, as an employer, I've done these calculations from the other side, and you basically, those benefits and all of the health care that you were talking about, it tacks on about 25% of your salary pretty consistently.
Yeah, and, then you think about that, even just to put dollars and cents, just look at healthcare, like, you're 12 or 15 grand a year in the hole when you don't have someone else defraying some of those costs, so it's tough. So, I just think it's important for you to know this and have that out there. So, if we've talked about assets, anyone who's slept through Accounting 101 knows that we're gonna go to the other side of the ledger, which is liabilities or your debt. So, step two of the fabulous five is to figure out, what is the debt that's outstanding or any other liabilities. And so that could mean your mortgage, it could be a line of credit, it could be a credit card, it could be a car loan, it could be an education loan. And all of that is to say that you don't need to do anything with it, but it's important to know this. And I think it's important that you have just a sense of what that debt level is and what it looks like in the future. Is it going to be paid down sooner or later? You're not making any action items off of this list, by the way. These fabulous five is just information. You don't have to do anything with it. The third step is to consider your housing situation. And we're going to talk about that, I know, but like, a lot of people have seen their housing situation shift amid COVID. There's a lot of people who were buying homes that never thought they'd buy a home for another 5 or 8 years. And here they are, they own a home. There are a lot of people who own homes and the values have increased. So a lot of this is just to consider, like, where is my housing situation? Am I happy in my home? Is there something else I need to consider? Um, Step 4, and I have a whole other chapter on this, is just to consider what you're spending money on. And I just want you to know that even though people hate doing this, I don't like budgets. I don't even like saying a cash flow statement. I just want you to know, what are you spending money on? No judgment. You, your family, I don't really care what you spend. You don't need to care about it right this second. Just, you need to have the number, because without this number, it's almost impossible to do any planning. And I think the fifth step of the fabulous five is to really think hard about the obligations you might have made to others. For
Mm.
example, did you tell your kids, oh, we're going to pay for your private university education? Well, if you're making a big reset, or if you were to lose your job and you were 52 years old, would you still be able to make that obligation? Do we need to have a different conversation? Did you tell your siblings that you were going to help take care of your aging parents? And by making a big change in your life, you might not be able to? These 5 steps are critical in you just having the basic information you need to make responsible decisions going forward.
I'm one of the things that is entertaining about this book and why I think people will like it so much is that it's not just advice, it's stories. And there's a story in the book about Rebecca and Jean and the obligations that their adult kids actually felt they owed them in their maintenance of the family house. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's so weird. I feel bad for all of my friends who end up in these books. So I'm just going to say that names have been changed, but some of you might find yourself into my book. So be careful. This is a friend of mine who really doesn't live in Detroit, but I put her in Detroit. So
Detroit's
um,
a good place. I was born in Detroit. Nothing
there,
wrong with Detroit.
exactly. So there's nothing wrong with it, but you know, I think it's what's interesting is that so this is a friend of mine who really did give up a career to be the stay-at-home mom, and she became honestly like the professional stay-at-home mom, and that meant she did a lot of stuff, and it's pretty amazing. And her husband Gene was the main wage earner, and he earned a bunch of money. He was a big marketing executive. And so he had always like in the back of his head felt like there was like one more interesting chapter for him that he didn't want to just gut it out, earning a lot of money, major six-figure job. But he was kind of like always felt like I wanted to be part of a startup. And he did get the opportunity of like, oh my God, I'm so psyched. It's like we're going to move to the West Coast and I'm going to be able to do this. And all this is like completely like dreamlike for them. And I think it was kind of cool for them to be able to do this. But the reality was that their kids had a very negative reaction to this. They had been very good parents. Their adult children were pretty lucky. They got school paid for, graduate school, and like many, I would say, snowplow parents, they would smooth over bumps in the road ahead with big expenses that they would pay for that stuff. And I think what was interesting is that the kids were really reluctant to be like, how could you do this? Like, what do you mean? Like the family home, and how are we going to see our friends when we go home for reunions and this? And it was pretty rough, right? And I remember hearing these stories and I felt like, God, those kids are coming in pretty hot right now. But I think that one of the things that became clear was that the patterns that they had created with their kids really would make the kids feel like upended by this kind of decision. And I think that the reality is in a lot of the stories that I tell that the emotional factor, whether it's with your spouse, with your kids, with your aging parents, all these things actually are at least, if not more important than the numbers. I set out the book in the beginning to give you the numbers part because I think it is so much harder to navigate the emotional part.
Oh no.
And in the stories in the book, what I'm trying to help you see is that that emotional part needs a lot of attention as well.
I think that's particularly true when it comes to retirement. We've talked on this show before about how there's a whole industry that has emerged in the last couple of years in retirement coaches,
Hmm.
people who help you figure out how you are going to adjust to this new phase of life, not how you're going to pay for it, but actually how you are going to just deal with the fact that life is changing. Let's talk about retirement from the numbers perspective
Mm.
first. When it's a reset that is being foisted upon you, and I'm always struck by the fact that about 2/3 of people are retired. They are not retiring by choice at the time that they plan. When retirement is foisted upon you, how do you get a grip on your financial life to deal with this reset that you weren't expecting?
I think you're right. I feel like a lot of people are reactive to this notion, and you're forced to. And many people, even if they have run the numbers, it is startling when it's happened. Just to bring the emotional part back, that someone has really pulled the rug out from under you. Right? You have lost control, and you rarely make very good decisions when you're at that loss of control moment. So, first moment that you hear this kind of news, obviously you go back and you do take account of the numbers, because I think that that's actually going to give you a little bit of a good focus of your emotional energy, right? So let me just look at the tallying up. Now, let me look ahead. Let's just pretend, I'm 50, I'll do the 52 years old. I thought I was going to work till I was 60. I thought I was going to work for 15 more years, and I'm going to make it up, $200,000 a year for 15 more years. And now I'm making zero. What happens next? Well, once you go through your numbers, I think you start to really look ahead and you say, okay, what am I going to do for the next 15 years? Can I get another job? Do I need to get another job to support myself? Because that's important. Do I have a partner who's working or not working? Is that partner willing to work and let me kind of look around for a while and get my feet in a new place? Or do I really have to hurry up? Am I the main breadwinner and just get a job? And I think that once you get your numbers right, in terms of where you are, I think looking ahead and saying, well, wait a second. When I was on that course of where I was going to work 15 more years, making $200,000 a year, maybe I was thinking that I had to spend exactly the way I was going to spend today, and maybe that's not the case anymore.
Mm.
Maybe if I really take a good hard look at everything I'm spending, and I really ask myself, wait a minute. If I could get a job where I kind of feel like happier and have a little more balance, could I spend less money and still be okay? Would that make these numbers work? And I think, especially when you're in a partnership and you're in your 50s and you've lived a life and you talk together about like what it is that you really want to do in the future, this is like a critical moment, because you don't have control on the income side as much as you thought, but you do have a control over your spend. And if that means you do a few less expensive trips, if that means you have a real conversation with your adult kids about what you can and can't do, if that means you can find a job that where you really believe you'd be extremely happy and you'd be working till you're well into your 70s because of that, and you're gonna earn less money, that's okay too. But again, I think figuring out where you are, figuring out what you're willing to spend money on, and looking ahead is a really important part of a surprise retirement. And then I think that this also gets into the idea that for a lot of people, they say, oh, I'm in my forever house. I'm 52 years old. I've just lost my job. Is this really my forever house? Do I have a whole bunch of equity stuck in this house? Could I actually move to a better place where I would be able to sock some money away in the process? Could we be renters and be happy? Stories of early retirement or change in retirement or financial independence and a new endeavor really often will involve thinking beyond what your original plan was, if you even had one, and contemplating what it is you want to do and try to craft the life that'll get you there.
How hard is that to wrap your brain around? You tell a story in the book of Tom and Pam, and selling their house, which I looked at that story and I was like, could I do that? I don't know.
Wait a minute, you just did it. You sold
Well,
New
I
York
sold
and you
my
bought
house.
Philly.
I did, but they didn't buy another house. That was where I got stuck, right? I bought this place that you see behind me, which is an apartment in Philadelphia. It's not a house. I don't have a grill outside. I definitely miss that. But it's a house that we own, right? And
Mhm.
there's something to that. Pam and Tom they went rogue.
Okay, I love this story so much. It's one of my favorite stories, but I'm also gonna tell you a story about my own mother, and I think I've
Okay.
told you this story before, but, um, so Pam and Tom Pam was a nurse. She's in the operating room. It's like high COVID, and, it is a very intense time, and this is what they're talking about, by the way, when you're on the table, like, having your appendectomy and you're out, this is what's going on in the operating room. The doctor says, I think it's the end of 2020-ish. And it says like, oh my God, the real estate market's going crazy. This is lived outside Pittsburgh. And she said, what do you mean? Because we weren't really paying attention to this. Like we were in the middle of crisis. People weren't really thinking about this, especially people who owned homes weren't like thinking, oh, the value of my house is going up. And so this doctor says to Pam, like, you should go talk to someone who's a realtor. You would be shocked. Like, houses are going like crazy, and you live in a really nice area, and you should check this out. So she goes home and she talks to her husband, Tom. He's also in healthcare. He's a physical therapist, and he's stretched. They're just like stretched to the max. Now, these folks are in their 50s, okay? They are struggling in a weird way. They make a lot of money, but they're both working their butts off. And she's working overtime because they have loans for their kids' college education. They have a mortgage on their home, and they even have a little credit card and auto loan debt just because they're floating it. And she's working so many hours and so hard and burdened in some respects simply to pay those obligations. Okay. Now they thought they'd like grit it out till they were like 62, 65, however long it takes, and then we'll be fine. Well, she goes home. She says to Tom, like, let's call the realtor friend. Realtor friend comes over and says, here's how much your house is worth. And it's a ridiculous number. Like, it was a number that was so astounding to them. She said she actually gasped. She was like, I cannot even believe it. And quick back of the envelope calculation, she says, we sell our house. We pay off the debt of the mortgage. We pay off the school loans. We pay off the credit card debt. We pay off the car loans. We still have money in the bank.
Wow.
And she said to Tom, I don't want to own another home. I don't want another mortgage. I can't even think about that. I feel like I'm drowning, but slowly. And it's exhausting. And he went on this like great journey. He was reluctant, by the way. He was the one who was like, I don't know, we wouldn't own a place. He found them a long-term Airbnb where they were like living on a farm a little bit on the outside of Pittsburgh. They would commute in, but essentially like the happy ending of that story is that the rent is not that expensive because they're farther out and very few people want to live on a farm. She loves horses. That's fine. They are debt free and she's not working as many hours. And as a result, she said to me, I feel like I can now have a new lease on life because I feel like I can work till I'm 67 or 70.
Wow.
Before I felt like I was going to die just to get to 62 because I was working so many hours. She's pulled back. He's pulled back. They are living well. They are not eating into their savings. They've completely changed their consumption. They've extracted the equity from their homes, and they are emotionally both so much better off.
And how has it set them up on their retirement trajectory? Yes, they'll be able to work longer, but are they still, I mean, for a lot of people that chunk of money in their home is a supplemental chunk of money for retirement.
So,
Have,
interestingly, great point, because when they had all that debt, she had pulled back on her contributions to her 403(b).
mm,
So their cash flow has improved so vastly that they're both putting more money away for retirement right now. And look, do I think that they're going to live on a farm for the rest of their lives? Probably not. They may buy again, they may not. And maybe renting is okay. I've always said this, even though I am a person who owns two places, which is horrifying to me because I love renting. I think I've told you this story. When my father died, he was in his 70s, and my mother had a house. And, a builder knocked on her door and said, I'd like to buy your house and knock it down and build something here. And she was like, well, where am I going to live? And so my sister and I went out looking at places with her, and like places that would be easier and this, that, and my sister said, maybe you should rent. And my mother said, I have not rented an apartment since like your father and I were first married and we were like 22 years old. That seems terrible. And the long story short is 10 years later, my mother is the happiest renter in the world. So all the equity from her home is invested. It has been a great deal for her. Her rent is not cheap, but it's not terrible. And if you live in a high cost of living area, sometimes your taxes and the maintenance of your home, all those things you kind of forget about, just forgetting about the actual equity in your home adds up. And most importantly, emotionally, she feels like it's not her problem. And now that she's in her 80s, she feels like the happiest renter in the world. And she just said to me this morning on our daily phone call, what am I going to do if she doesn't want to renew the lease? I said, don't worry, we'll deal with it. I said, you'll go live with Kim because she's not living here.
Your mother's in her 80s, my mother's in her 80s, and I think that's the other important
Mm,
piece of this puzzle. You can reboot, right? You can reset yourself in your 50s, in your 60s, maybe even in your 70s, but you've got to do it in a way that pretty much guarantees that you will have
mm.
enough money to live on for the rest of your life, and knowing that at some point you probably will not be able to continue to work. How are you talking to people these days about being able to do that with longevity continuing to rise despite the little pandemic blip that we experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always funny. I remember when I was a financial planner, I was running numbers for somebody, and I was like making the case you have to save more money now because you're probably going to live till you're 90 or 95. And the client looks at me and says, "But what if I died at 80?" I'm like, "That's your game plan? Like die sooner? That sounds like a very bad game plan to me." And I think that people, even when people are thinking about making these changes, one thing about the pandemic that I think was very important was that it really did hyper focus us on, being able to work longer and living a healthier life and being there for each other and wanting to be there for our aging parents, but, being there for our kids and not wanting to be a burden. I think a lot of people found out some devastating things about their families, their parents' financial condition amid
Mm,
COVID. All of a sudden, you're like in your people's business, right? Because we were all in this together. And you may have found that your 86-year-old mother has no money. And, because, oh, by the way, she didn't actually pay her bills on time. And then you swooped in to do that. So I think that when I'm talking to people, especially about resetting, or having your life reset for you, I think it is imperative to talk about, hey, you could easily be not working, unemployed from age 55 to 95. And so, in other words, you could have a 40-year career and a 40-year retirement. And you better be prepared to look at that in a very honest way. And this is one of the reasons why I get very nervous about when people say to me, life is short. I'm just going to spend a bunch of money, while I'm still healthy. Uh huh. That's true. But still, one of the hugest mistakes that people make is they still retire too soon and spend too much money early in their retirement. And the third mistake, of course, being that they don't consider just how long they're going to live. So, I am annoyingly consistent about this message, which is you're 57. What are you going to do for the rest of your life? You're not retiring. Like, you got to do something. And if you're not going to do anything, you better have saved a pile of money that can earn money for you for the rest of your life.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And to go back to our first point, you better have a plan
Hmm.
to figure out how that money can earn you money for the rest of your life. I mean, fortunately for savers, we're at least in an environment where that money is
Mm.
earning a little bit more than it used to be, but it means investing. It means potentially looking at ways to guarantee yourself some lifetime income if you don't have a pension. It's a complicated calculation. I'm always struck by how much more complicated it is to figure out how to decumulate your assets than it is to accumulate them in the first place.
Oh, yeah, and I think that people have a real problem with that. I mean, if you are a natural saver, not only do you have, like, sort of the mathematical challenge ahead of you, which is the number of years and the money you need to earn to keep pace with inflation, but You also have this concept where if you're a natural saver, you've been saving and accumulating your whole life. If you're 68 years old, you've got to give yourself permission to tap your money.
Yes.
That's a very hard lesson to learn. And I think for a lot of people, it's unnerving. So, you might be lucky enough, you've saved a pile of money, you've got millions of dollars, and yet you say, well, I'm scared.
Hmm.
Okay, well, we need to show you that mathematically, it's okay that you're scared emotionally, but mathematically this should work. And here's why. And if you're not working with a financial planner who can do this, there's a lot of resources online if you're doing it yourself. But the idea here is to not pull so much money out of your portfolio at once so that you're going to derail your plan. And it is a little bit of the idea that I kind of grew up with, which was this, I'm now calling it the now debunked 4% rule that,
Yes,
it's
exactly.
right. So the now debunked. So when I got into financial planning, the rule was, oh, if you have $1 million, you can take 4% out of your portfolio every year safely, or 40 grand, and you won't run out of money. And I don't think that that's really the issue. The issue is you can take some amount of money out of your portfolio every year. You may have to spend it down. Your number one goal is to make sure that you and your partner or spouse are okay through your lives. Your number one goal should not be, I'm leaving a legacy to my kids. So I really want to disabuse people of that notion, because the worst thing is to be like, you don't spend any of your money, you feel crappy at the end of your life, and your kids get money, but you're unhappy. That doesn't seem like a good game
Right.
plan to me. Not good at all. But I do think that it's really important for people to understand that it's probably more like 2 or 2.5%. There are a lot of people who run these numbers for a living. They're very smart. Maybe it's 3%. But on a year like last year, where both the stock and the bond markets were down and everyone got crushed together, a lot of people were like, wait, I don't know how much money I really want to take out of the portfolio. So there are some people who feel better taking a little bit more money out in a year where the market does well, and taking a little bit less money out when the market doesn't do as well. And some people are lucky enough that they have pensions or streams of income, or they have annuity payments that like float their lifestyle. And I know that that you've talked a lot on this show about having a stream of income that can really alleviate some of the uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that to me is what we're trying to do, is that you're trying, look, life is uncertain, risk abounds. You're just trying to mitigate it. And the way that you mitigate it for you and your family is up to you. But there are ways to mitigate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Evidently, I'm having a little bit of a technical issue on my side because I keep my camera keeps resetting here. So we are going to wrap up this conversation because
No.
that's a very good place. Yes, because that's a very good place to leave it. Actually, Jill, if we want more information about the great book, the Great Financial Reboot, where do we find it, and where do we find out more about you?
So I am at jillonmoney.com. Jillonmoney.com is my website. The Great Money Reset is available wherever you buy books, but you can get links to it on the website. And I've got podcasts, and I have what else do I have? I have a bunch of stuff. Just go to jillonmoney.com. It's awfully fun. And I'm so grateful for you. And Jean, I can't thank you enough. You've always been such a wonderful supporter and friend. And I appreciate everything you do and have done for me and for everyone out there, with your amazing financial advice and your presence, which is just gorgeous. So thank
Oh,
you.
well, thank you for that, and right back at you. And if you're looking for more information on this conversation specifically, you can find it at protectedincome.org/Schlesinger. Thank you. See you soon.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.